Friedrich von der Trenck, a name that became synonymous with a desperate adventurer, an indomitable prisoner, and a man whose life intertwined with the destinies of Europe's greatest monarchs. He was not merely a brilliant Prussian officer, a dandy, and a court favorite, but an ambitious confidant of Frederick the Great himself, whose downfall and disgrace marked the beginning of an endless odyssey. This man, pursued by the king, accused of espionage, and imprisoned in the most dreadful dungeons, executed several audacious, almost inconceivable escapes, each becoming a legend in its own right. Trenck traveled across Europe, spied, intrigued, was captured again, and again escaped, transforming his biography into a thrilling adventure novel. He became a living legend, a symbol of the struggle for personal freedom and unyielding will. And his memoirs, full of dramatic details and exaggerations, were read voraciously, shaping the image of a romantic hero, a victim of tyranny. Yet the end of his story proved far more cynical than any fiction, shattering this heroic aura. The Baron, who had survived decades of brutal imprisonment in the most horrific casemates of Prussia and Austria, was executed by guillotine in Paris in 1799. He fell victim not to monarchical arbitrariness, but to a revolutionary court that he himself had once hailed as the triumph of reason and liberty. This is not merely the story of a sufferer, but the tragedy of a gambler whose final stake proved fatal, exposing the true nature of a hero in an era of great upheavals. To understand how a man who seemed an unsinkable symbol of individual liberty ultimately found himself crushed by the millstones of history, we must rewind the tape to the very origins of his character. Friedrich von der Trenck was born in 1726 in Königsberg, in the heart of East Prussia, into an old but not particularly wealthy noble family. His father, a major general, commanded a cuirassier regiment, and his mother belonged to one of East Prussia's most prominent families. From childhood, Friedrich was surrounded by an atmosphere of strict military discipline and ambition, typical of 18th-century Prussian nobility. It was no idol. Despite their grand title, the family lived modestly, and his father's ambitions, never reaching the pinnacle of his career, weighed heavily on his sons. Friedrich, like many young nobles of his circle, was destined for a military career. He enrolled at Königsberg University, where he studied law, but his true passions were horses, fencing, and, of course, court life. At 20 in 1746, Trenck became a cornet lieutenant in Frederick the Great's own life cuirassier regiment. This was the moment when a provincial nobleman received his ticket to high society. Young, handsome, and daring, he quickly caught the monarch's attention, known for his fondness for young, talented officers. Frederick the Great, himself intellectually gifted, valued Trenck not only for his military talents, but also for his wit and education. Trenck became not just an officer, but a favorite, instantly sparking envy and intrigue at court. It was here, in this toxic atmosphere of courtly flattery and backroom maneuvering, that the tragic chain of events began. Friedrich von der Trenck was not born a simple adventurer. He became one, cornered by circumstances and his own, often unwise, decisions. The main catalyst for his downfall was, of course, his alleged affair with Princess Amalia, the king's younger sister. This story, often romanticized in his memoirs as a great love, actually became a fatal trap. For the Prussian court, where intrigues were commonplace and the king jealously guarded his family, such a connection, even if it was merely a rumor, was tantamount to treason. Frederick the Great, a pragmatic and ruthless ruler, could not afford such a scandal, which threatened his authority and dynasty. In his eyes, Trenck had crossed an invisible yet absolutely unbreakable line. This was not merely the end of a career, it was a point of no return, after which the Baron's life transformed into an endless flight from the shadow of the powerful monarch, a constant struggle for survival, where every step was dictated not so much by the pursuit of freedom as by the necessity of avoiding retribution. This point of no return, which irrevocably altered Friedrich von der Trenck's life, was only possible within the conditions of the 18th century absolutist state, where the monarch's will was not merely law, but an all-encompassing, sometimes irrational force capable of elevating or destroying any subject. In Frederick the Great's Prussia, despite his enlightened ideas and philosophical pursuits, power remained absolute and unlimited. The king did not merely govern the state, he was the state, and his personal authority, his family and his court, were inviolable symbols of this autocratic might. Court life in those times was not just a succession of balls and receptions, but a brutal arena for the ruthless struggle for influence and favor. Anyone who dared to approach the pinnacles of power automatically became a target for the envious, gossips, and schemers. There were no infallible reputations. One careless word, one false denunciation, one misinterpreted gesture could lead to complete catastrophe. For young, ambitious men like Trenck, who did not possess vast inheritances, the only path to advancement lay through royal favor. But with proximity to the throne came unprecedented danger. The most sensitive point of this complex mechanism was the royal family. Dynastic marriages, political alliances, purity of blood, all these formed the foundation of European monarchies. Any connection, even a rumor of one, between a member of the royal family and someone not belonging to the highest aristocracy was perceived not as a personal drama, but as an act undermining the very foundations of the state. This was not merely a breach of decorum, but an assault on the stability of the dynasty itself, on the reputation of the crown. In the eyes of Frederick the Great, whose power was built on the strictest discipline and unbreakable order, such an act was tantamount to high treason, not simply adultery. Prussian society, especially its military elite, was permeated by a rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience. The army was the bulwark of the throne, and the officer corps was the king's personal instrument. In this system, where every step was regulated and honor and loyalty were valued above all else, the emergence of a favorite who rapidly rose above the old guard inevitably created tension. The accusation of espionage, which would later be leveled against Trenck, was not simply a convenient pretext. In an era of constant struggle for geopolitical dominance, when spy networks entangled all of Europe and monarchs distrusted each other, any suspicious connection could be interpreted as a threat to national security. Thus, the fertile ground for Trenck's tragedy was shaped not by his personal qualities, but by the very structure of absolutist Prussia. It was a world where the king's favor was ephemeral, court intrigues were deadly, and dynastic interests superseded any human fate. In such a system, even the most brilliant and fortunate individual could be instantly crushed for a single wrong move, becoming a victim not so much of personal revenge as of the ruthless logic of the state machine. The point of no return led to Trenck's immediate arrest. In 1747, just a year after his brilliant appearance at court, Friedrich von der Trenck was seized and, without trial, thrown into Glatz Fortress, one of Prussia's grimmest prisons. The official charge was espionage for Austria, but the true reason was clear to all. The king did not forgive challenges to his authority and family. This was not just imprisonment, but a signal to anyone daring to cross the line. For a young officer accustomed to luxury and universal attention, prison was a shock, but also the forge of his legend. It was in Glatz that Trenck made his first, now legendary escape, which made all of Europe speak of him. After several months of confinement, in 1748, he managed to bribe one of the guards, and then, taking advantage of fog and a distracted watch, scaled the fortress wall. The drama of the story was heightened by the fact that he did not escape alone, but with two other prisoners whom he convinced to join him. This audacious act not only brought him fame, but also showcased his incredible ingenuity, coolness under pressure, and, importantly, his ability to manipulate people. He didn't just escape, he gambled everything, and fortune smiled upon him. Once free, Trenck headed to Austria, a country that was then Prussia's main geopolitical adversary. Here, another no less convoluted chapter of his life awaited him: service under his cousin, Baron Franz von der Trenck, the infamous commander of irregular troops, nicknamed the Panderer. This period of his biography, often romanticized as the free life of an adventurer, was actually filled with dubious financial dealings and morally ambiguous decisions. Franz von der Trenck, a highly controversial figure himself, used his young cousin in his schemes involving soldier recruitment and financial management. Friedrich, desperately in need of funds and patronage, quickly adapted to this murky world, demonstrating surprising shrewdness and a lack of scruples. He did not shy away from questionable transactions, skillfully extracted money, and used his position to amass a small fortune. However, when Franz von der Trenck himself faced trial for abuse and cruelty, Friedrich, instead of showing loyalty, was quick to distance himself from his relative. He presented himself as a victim of circumstance, a naive executor of another's will, though he had actively participated in the dubious schemes. This episode, carefully whitewashed in his later memoirs, exposes a pragmatism bordering on cynicism, which was an integral part of his character. He was not an idealistic freedom fighter at this stage. He was a man who used every opportunity to survive and succeed. Having lost his patron, Trenck found himself in limbo. Without a steady source of income and at risk of arrest for debts, he made one of the most controversial decisions of his life. In 1749, he attempted to return to Prussia, claiming he wished to settle inheritance matters and seek royal pardon. Perhaps he underestimated Frederick the Great's vindictiveness, or perhaps he overestimated his own luck. In any case, his return was a fatal mistake. No sooner had he crossed the border than he was seized by Prussian agents and again imprisoned, this time for a much longer period. This story, which he would later present as a treacherous betrayal by the Prussian court, was in fact the result of his own risky calculations and complete disregard for consequences. Trenck's second imprisonment proved incomparably harsher. He was thrown into the infamous citadel of Magdeburg, a fortress prison from which, it was believed, there was no escape. Here he spent 10 years, locked in an underground cell, shackled, deprived of light and communication. It seemed this fate should have broken anyone, turning them into a silent shadow. But it was precisely in these inhumane conditions that the unique set of qualities emerged that allowed Friedrich von der Trenck not only to survive, but also to forge around himself an aura of an indomitable hero. His main weapon was astonishing psychological resilience and self-discipline. In Magdeburg, where every day was a struggle to maintain sanity, Trenck developed his own survival system. He memorized the Bible, recited poetry for hours, and performed mental mathematical calculations to keep his mind sharp. But this was only the external aspect. Far more important was his remarkable ability to influence those around him, even from the depths of his dungeon. He masterfully played on human weaknesses: greed, pity, vanity. He didn't just bribe guards, he created a semblance of an emotional connection with them, transforming them from overseers into unwitting accomplices, or, at the very least, sympathizers. His charisma, already tested at Frederick the Great's court, did not wane behind prison walls. He knew how to find experts among fellow prisoners or even among casual prison visitors, people with the necessary skills or information. In Glatz, he convinced 2 other prisoners to escape with him, using not only promises, but also his conviction, his vibrant energy. In Magdeburg, despite his isolation, he managed to send letters to the outside world, in which he skillfully presented himself as a victim of royal arbitrariness, an unjustly condemned sufferer. These letters, full of dramatic details, not only sustained interest in his person, but also created the hype around his name that transformed him from an ordinary prisoner into a living legend, an object of European curiosity and sympathy. He was a master of adaptation. In his youth, a brilliant officer and courtier, then a participant in dubious financial operations in Austria, and now a prisoner, turning every crack in the wall, every speck of earth into a tool for escape. His endless attempts to dig tunnels, saw through chains, outwit guards. All of this was not just desperate acts. These were carefully planned operations where he used his engineering skills, knowledge of guard psychology, and incredible endurance. Each failure did not break him, but became a new lesson, a new opportunity to refine his toolkit. He didn't just want freedom, he wanted his struggle to be known, for his story to inspire. He intuitively understood the power of narrative, the power of his own legend, and actively worked to create it, even while in complete isolation. This ability to turn personal tragedy into a public spectacle, maintaining interest in his person for decades, was perhaps his most outstanding and cynical talent. His meticulously constructed narrative, disseminated through secret letters, quickly broke free from his cell, finding fertile ground across Europe. These messages were not mere pleas for mercy or desperate cries from a prisoner. They transformed into genuine political manifestos in which Friedrich von der Trenck masterfully portrayed himself as an innocent victim of royal arbitrariness, a martyr of the Enlightened age suffering from tyranny. Every word was calculated, every detail exaggerated to elicit the maximum response. And the response was not long in coming. Such stories of unjustly imprisoned noblemen always resonated, but in the 18th century, during the Age of Enlightenment, they gained particular poignancy. European courts, diplomats, intellectuals, and even the general public, captivated by new ideas of human rights and limitations on monarchical power, eagerly devoured every word about the Baron. The main beneficiary of this image, besides Trenck himself, was, of course, Austria, Prussia's eternal geopolitical adversary. Trenck's story served as an excellent propaganda tool, allowing Austrian diplomacy and journalism to portray Frederick the Great not as an enlightened philosopher on the throne, but as a cruel, vengeful despot who tolerated no dissent or challenges to his authority. Trenck, unknowingly or perhaps intuitively understanding, became a pawn in this larger game, his suffering transformed into a trump card in an information war. Meanwhile, the main antagonist, Frederick the Great himself, remained unyielding. His stubborn refusal to release Trenck, despite the prisoner's growing European fame and even the intercession of some influential figures, only heightened the drama of the situation. The king, known for his iron will and principled stance on matters of power, could not afford to show weakness. Releasing Trenck would have been tantamount to admitting his own mistake, or even worse, capitulating to public opinion and external pressure. For Frederick, whose power was built on unbreakable authority and fear, Trenck was not just a former favorite, but a symbol of defiance who had to serve as an example. Thus, it was the king's inflexibility, his unwavering determination to keep the Baron in the most dreadful conditions, that transformed a personal drama into a public myth, and Trenck into a living embodiment of the struggle against absolutism. His patrons were not so much specific individuals as they were the ideas of the Enlightenment, which made his story relevant and resonant. Sympathy for the victim of tyranny was not just an emotion, it was a political statement. Friedrich von der Trenck, despite being in the deepest isolation, managed to become part of European intellectual and political discourse. He was not just a prisoner, he was a project that everyone could use in their own way, to criticize monarchy, to romanticize heroism, to express empathy for human suffering. His story, shaped from within the prison and widely disseminated outside, became a powerful tool that transformed him from a disgraced officer into a suffering hero whose fate was inextricably linked to the confrontation with a powerful monarch and his ruthless state machine. After a decade spent in the gloomy casemates of Magdeburg, Friedrich von der Trenck finally gained his freedom. His release in 1763 was not the result of royal mercy, but a simple prisoner exchange, a mundane diplomatic practice in which his personal tragedy was merely a minor bargaining chip. The Prussian court, tired of his endless escapes and the European resonance surrounding his name, simply wanted to get rid of this inconvenient symbol. However, upon leaving prison, Trenck did not become the icon of freedom he desired. He was physically broken, but his ambitions, his restless energy, his thirst for recognition, all this only intensified. Trenck's first stop was Vienna, where, leveraging his newfound fame, he attempted to settle long-standing financial matters related to the inheritance of his cousin, Franz von der Trenck. It was here, in relative calm, that he embarked on the main project of his life, writing his memoirs. These recollections, published decades later, became a bestseller, instantly transforming him from a former prisoner into a global celebrity. He meticulously, but quite freely, described his misfortunes, exaggerated details of torture and escapes, romanticized his affair with Princess Amalia, transforming himself into a martyr, a victim of tyranny, and an unfortunate lover. Trenck's memoirs are not merely an autobiography, they are a masterfully constructed narrative where facts are closely intertwined with fiction, and personal pain is used as a tool to create a grandiose, almost mystical image. These books brought him not only fame but also considerable wealth. For the next 30 years, he traveled across Europe, met with monarchs and philosophers, engaged in diamond trading, acted as an adventurer, and even a spy, though his espionage feats were more a product of imagination than a real threat. He attempted to establish trading companies, engaged in dubious investments, constantly seeking new ways to enrich himself and confirm his special status. His life after liberation was a series of business ventures where he alternately soared to success and suffered ruin, repeatedly demonstrating his ability to survive and his lack of scruples in financial matters. He was a man who knew how to profit from any situation, be it a prison cell or a European court. But his true, fatal error, that very last gamble, was made not at a gaming table or in a dungeon. It was made on the arena of history. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Trenck, already elderly but still restless, saw in it not just a political upheaval, but the triumph of those very Enlightenment ideals for which he believed he himself had suffered for decades. He, a victim of absolutism, wholeheartedly welcomed the fall of the monarchy, seeing in it a personal victory. In 1792, in the midst of the Revolutionary Terror, he accepted French citizenship, and then, in 1793, even moved to Paris, intending to actively participate in building a new world. He dreamed of a position in the new government, of recognition for his services to liberty. This was a monstrous miscalculation. Trenck, accustomed to the world of intrigue and backroom maneuvering of the 18th century, failed to understand the true nature of the revolution, its ruthlessness and all-consuming logic. He, a former aristocrat, albeit a disgraced one, tried to find his place among the Jacobins, whose rhetoric and methods were alien to his own experience. He was blind to the fact that the revolution, like an insatiable monster, began to devour its own children, regardless of who was a victim of the old regime and who its champion. His memoirs, though glorifying the fight against tyranny, were written by a nobleman who, despite all his suffering, still remained part of the world that the revolution sought to destroy. He was a romantic who failed to see how the ideals of the Enlightenment had transformed into the guillotine. His downfall, as swift as his rise at the Prussian court, was inevitable. He himself became a victim of a new, far more comprehensive and ruthless apparatus than Frederick the Great's absolutism had ever been. After his release from Magdeburg, Friedrich von der Trenck immediately plunged into a new, seemingly more profitable adventure. Despite a decade of imprisonment, his charisma and persuasive abilities remained undiminished. Soon after arriving in Vienna, he secured a lucrative concession from the Austrian crown for the development of copper mines in Hungary. Trenck, a master of self-promotion, presented this project not merely as a business, but as a grand opportunity for rapid enrichment, promising investors fabulous profits. His name, already imbued with the aura of a martyr and hero, became a powerful magnet. Not only private individuals, but also representatives of noble families, lured by promises of enormous dividends, invested huge sums in the baron's enterprise. However, once actual mining began, it became clear that the deposit Trenck had so generously promised was almost empty. Any ore found contained extremely low amounts of copper, making development completely unprofitable. Millions of guilders invested in the project literally dissolved into the Hungarian depths. Investors, including members of the royal court, were completely ruined. Their loud complaints and attempts to reclaim their capital came to nothing. Trenck himself, as always, managed to escape unscathed. He masterfully shifted the blame to dishonest geologists, unforeseen geological features, and malicious competitors, skillfully avoiding direct accusations of fraud and serious legal consequences. The Austrian crown, which had granted the concession, promptly annulled the agreement to minimize reputational damage. It avoided a direct scandal, but lost potential tax revenues and the trust of part of the elite who had been deceived. This episode clearly demonstrated that behind the facade of a romantic hero lay an unscrupulous schemer, willing to engage in any swindle for personal gain, leaving a trail of financial ruin and shattered hopes. His heroism was merely a tool for new, far more cynical machinations. And yet, despite a series of financial collapses and moral compromises, the image of Friedrich von der Trenck not only survived, but grew into something far grander than himself. The European public, captivated by his memoirs, didn't wish to see him as a calculating schemer or a dubious adventurer. They craved a hero, a victim of tyranny, and Trenck, unknowingly or intuitively sensing this, masterfully satisfied that need. Thus arose one of the most astonishing paradoxes of the 18th century. A man whose life was a succession of opportunistic decisions and personal gain became a symbol of the struggle for principles and freedom. His real actions, dictated by survival and pragmatism, were buried beneath a layer of romantic fiction created by himself and embraced by society. This disconnect between truth and myth became a key element of his legacy. We see not so much a biography as a metaphor, a story of how human suffering, seasoned with a storyteller's talent and the opportune circumstances of an era, can transform into a powerful cultural phenomenon. Trenck was not an ideological revolutionary, but his figure was used as a banner against absolutism. He was not a saint, but his name became synonymous with an indomitable will. The irony of fate lies in the fact that, being a product of the very aristocratic system he purportedly denounced, he ultimately fell victim to the very force that was supposed to bring long-awaited freedom. The revolution he welcomed proved blind to his past, to his true nature, and ruthlessly consumed him, as it did many others. He was not merely a prisoner, but a hostage of his own myth, which ultimately destroyed him.